7-year-old Elle Bennett lost her mother to cancer, her world shattered into pieces she thought could never be put back together. But just when hope seemed out of reach, something incredible happened. At the Suber funeral service, none other than Johnny Depp arrived, holding a pirate chest and a plan that would change this little girl's life forever. Stay with us until the end to witness the heart-wrenching yet astonishing turn of events. You won't want to miss this. The cemetery was draped in a heavy gray mourning, the sky mirroring the grief that hung in the air. Rows of silent gravestones stood like frozen spectators to a sorrowful farewell. Among them, Elle Bennett, just 7 years old, stood motionless beside a polished mahogany casket. The black mourning dress hung loosely on her small frame, making her seem even more fragile. Her wide, tear-filled eyes never left the casket poised above an open grave, the final barrier between her and the mother she would never hold again. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh earth and an impending rain. Elle shivered, not from the cold, but from the reality sinking in. Just a few feet away, a newly placed marble tombstone bore her mother's name, Sharon Bennett. A photograph was etched onto its smooth surface, a familiar, smiling woman in a blue floral dress, eyes filled with warmth and love. The contrast between that joyful image and the cold, unfeeling wood of the casket was almost too much for Elle to bear. The funeral was small, a reflection of a life lived without wealth or grandeur. Only Elle, her grandmother Agnes Bennett, a solemn priest, and 3 funeral staff stood in a loose semicircle around the grave. Their silence was punctuated only by muffled sniffles and the occasional rustle of clothing. As the funeral staff prepared to lower the casket, a sudden, overwhelming urge surged through Elle's tiny chest. She took a shaky step forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you, Mommy." The words caught in her throat, threatening to break into sobs. Sensing the wave of grief washing over her granddaughter, Agnes quickly pulled Elle into her arms, murmuring soft reassurances, her voice thick with emotion. "Shoo, darling. Your mother is in a better place now. She's not hurting anymore." Elle pressed herself into her grandmother's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender. She wanted to believe it. Wanted to imagine her mother somewhere warm, free of pain, at peace. But the ache in her chest whispered otherwise. For those left behind, the pain was still very real. The priest, a kind-eyed man with graying hair, cleared his throat gently. "Shall we begin?" Agnes gave Elle's shoulders one last reassuring squeeze before letting go. The small gathering drew closer as the priest opened his prayer book and began. "We are gathered here today to commit Sharon Bennett to her eternal rest." His voice, steady yet compassionate, drifted over the empty cemetery. He spoke of love, of the lives Sharon had touched, of the legacy she left behind. But as he spoke, Elle's gaze drifted back to the photo on the tombstone. The smiling woman in that picture, how could she be the same person lying lifeless in that wooden box? How could someone so full of life simply cease to exist? The morning breeze picked up, rustling through the trees with a soft whisper. For just a fleeting moment, Elle swore she could hear her mother's voice in it, feel the warmth of an embrace that wasn't really there. She shut her eyes tight, wanting, needing, to believe that her mother was still with her, somehow. The priest's words carried on, speaking of hope, of resurrection, of a world beyond this one. Elle found herself wondering, could her mother hear this? Was she watching from somewhere above? She hoped so. She hoped her mother knew just how much she was missed. As the final prayer drew to a close, the funeral staff stepped forward. The time had come. The casket, the last tangible connection Elle had to her mother, was about to be lowered into the ground. Elle's heart raced. This was it. The final goodbye. Once that casket disappeared into the earth, it would be real. Final. Irreversible. Her lips parted, an urge to cry out, to beg them to stop, to give her just one more moment, but nothing came. The words were trapped behind a wall of grief too immense for her young heart to express. Agnes, sensing her granddaughter's anguish, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, squeezing it softly. "It's okay to cry, sweetheart," she whispered. Your mother would understand. But before the casket could be lowered, something happened that no one expected. A hush fell over the cemetery as a sleek black car pulled up. The driver stepped out, then opened the back door. And out stepped Johnny Depp. And in his hands, a pirate chest. What happened next was something Elle would never forget for the rest of her life. Stay with us, because this story is far from over. What happened next left everyone speechless. Elle nodded, feeling the first hot tears spill down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall freely, a silent testament to love and loss. The priest's voice rose in a final blessing, asking for peace for Sharon's soul and comfort for those left behind. As his words faded into the still morning air, a heavy silence settled over the small gathering. And then, something unexpected happened. A quiet flurry of whispers spread among the funeral staff. Their eyes were locked on a point beyond the grave, their faces etched with confusion and disbelief. Even in the depths of her grief, Elle noticed. Slowly, she turned to see what had captured their attention. Her breath hitched. A man was approaching. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he should have blended in with the somber setting, except for one peculiar detail. Perched atop his head was a Captain Jack Sparrow pirate hat. And then it hit her. Johnny Depp. Not just any man in a pirate hat, the Johnny Depp. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Even the wind, which had been rustling through the trees all morning, seemed to hold its breath. The priest, caught off guard, fell silent mid-prayer. Every single eye was now locked on the surreal scene unfolding before them. With deliberate, respectful steps, Johnny Depp walked toward the small gathering, his expression solemn but warm. In his hands, he carried an old wooden chest, its weathered surface making it look like something straight out of a pirate's tale. Then, in a slow, measured motion, he crouched down, bringing himself to Elle's eye level. Gently, he removed the pirate hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. His kind, familiar eyes met Elle's. "Hello, Elle," he said softly, his voice carrying just a hint of Jack Sparrow's signature drawl. "I hope you don't mind me joining you today. I have something for you, a gift from your mom." Elle blinked, her grief momentarily eclipsed by pure confusion. A gift? From her mom? She glanced up at her grandmother, searching for answers in Agnes's bewildered expression. I don't understand," Agnes murmured, her voice hesitant. Johnny nodded, acknowledging the strangeness of the moment. "I know this must seem odd," he admitted. "But I promise, I come with good intentions. Your mom, Sharon, she left something behind for you. Treasures she wanted you to have. Things she hoped would help carry her love forward." Then, carefully, he extended the pirate chest toward Elle. "Would you like to see what's inside?" For a long moment, Elle hesitated. Her small hands hovered near the chest, uncertainty flickering in her tear-streaked face. She looked up at Agnes once more. A silent question. "Is this okay?" Agnes, still visibly stunned, could only manage a small nod. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she whispered. "See what's inside." With trembling fingers, Elle lifted the lid. As it creaked open, a soft gasp escaped her lips. Inside, nestled among velvet lining, were treasures from her mother's life. A delicate gold locket caught the morning light, its surface etched with intricate designs. Beside it lay 2 wedding rings, one large, one smaller, simple, timeless bands that spoke of a love that had endured. And beneath them, carefully placed, was a worn leather-bound journal, its cover softened by years of use. Elle's fingers hovered over the items, her eyes wide with wonder, with sadness, with something new, a longing to hold on to every piece of her mother that remained. "The locket," she whispered, carefully lifting it. "Mommy used to wear this all the time." Johnny nodded, a soft smile touching his lips. "That's right," he said gently. "And now it's yours. To keep. If you'd like." Elle clutched the locket to her chest, her small fingers pressing it tightly against her heart, like she was holding onto her mother herself. Then her gaze fell to the wedding rings. A small frown creased her brow. "These were Mommy and Daddy's," she said softly. Then, after a pause, her voice wavered. "But shouldn't they stay with Mommy?" Johnny's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly impressed by the depth of thought from someone so young. "That's a very kind thought, Elle," he said. "What do you think we should do?" Elle thought for a long moment. Her tiny face was serious, concentrated, as if the weight of the decision was pressing down on her. Finally, she looked up at Johnny and Agnes and spoke with quiet certainty. "I want to keep the locket," she said firmly, asterisk in the journal. "But can we put the rings with Mommy? So she can keep them forever?" Agnes felt her throat tighten, tears brimming at the edges of her eyes. She knelt beside her granddaughter, wrapping a loving arm around her small shoulders. No one at that funeral would ever forget that moment. And neither will you. Because what Johnny Depp did next was something that would stay with Elle for the rest of her life. Stay with us, because this story is far from over. What happened next was a moment that no one in that cemetery would ever forget. Agnes knelt beside Elle, wrapping a comforting arm around her small shoulders. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think your mommy would love that." Johnny nodded in agreement. "A perfect choice," he said. With gentle care, he closed the pirate chest, now holding only the wedding rings, and turned to the funeral staff, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Would it be possible to place this with Sharon?" he asked, his tone respectful. One of the funeral workers quickly stepped forward, nodding. "Of course, sir. We'll arrange that right away." As the small wooden chest was placed alongside the casket, ready for its final descent, the priest cleared his throat, still looking slightly bewildered by the unexpected turn of events. Shall we continue with the service?" he asked hesitantly. Johnny took a step back, rejoining the small circle gathered around the grave. "Please," he said. "And I apologize for the interruption. Please, carry on." The priest resumed his solemn prayer, his words of comfort and hope filling the cold morning air. Elle stood between her grandmother and Johnny Depp, clutching her mother's locket in one hand and the journal in the other. The presence of the Hollywood star gave the moment an almost otherworldly quality. It felt as if, just for a brief time, the line between reality and fantasy had blurred. The service continued, the priest's voice steady. Elle listened, but her gaze remained fixed on the casket as it was slowly lowered into the earth. Her young mind struggled to grasp what it all meant: life, death, forever. These were concepts too big for her, too heavy to fully understand. But she understood love. She understood that even though her mother was gone, her memory would never fade. And as she held her mother's locket and journal close to her chest, she felt something else. A connection. A warmth. As if her mother's love still lingered, still wrapped around her, even from beyond. Then came the final ritual, the closing of the grave. A funeral worker stepped forward, offering the traditional shovel. Agnes was the first to take it, her hands trembling slightly as she scooped up a small amount of earth. With a deep breath, she let it fall onto the casket below. The sound, a soft, muffled thud, echoed in the quiet cemetery. Then, Johnny stepped forward. He took his turn, his actions solemn and respectful. Though he had never known Sharon Bennett, the weight of the moment was not lost on him. Finally, it was Elle's turn. Agnes knelt beside her, guiding her small hands to grasp the shovel. Together, they lifted a scoop of earth. Elle's fingers tightened around the wooden handle. Her lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke her final goodbye. "Goodbye, Mommy." The earth slipped from the shovel. "I love you." The last soft thud sent a wave of finality through her chest. And just like that, it was done. The priest spoke a few last words of comfort, and then, with quiet efficiency, the funeral staff began to pack up. One by one, they approached Agnes and Elle, offering quiet condolences before making their way out of the cemetery. The priest was the last to leave, pausing to place a comforting hand on Agnes's shoulder before disappearing down the path. And then there were three. Agnes. Johnny Depp. Standing before the fresh grave in the cold gray morning. The departure of the others marked a shift from a formal ceremony to something deeper, more personal. Elle felt it. The weight of reality pressing harder on her small shoulders. She clutched the locket and journal tighter, as if they were lifelines to the mother she had lost. The morning stretched on, silent and heavy, the overcast sky mirroring their grief. Elle stood still, her gaze locked onto the fresh mound of earth that now covered her mother's casket. She could still hear the soft whispers of the wind through the trees. But now, the sound felt different, like a voice she longed to recognize, but couldn't quite reach. Johnny didn't speak. He stood a respectful distance away, his presence comforting but surreal in the somber setting. His gaze flickered toward Elle. Her small fingers were tracing the delicate contours of the locket, her touch gentle and reverent. After several long moments, she shifted her focus to the journal. Its worn cover spoke of years of use, of thoughts carefully recorded, of memories too precious to lose. She ran her fingers over the soft leather, imagining her mother doing the same. "This was Mommy's," she murmured, almost to herself. Her voice was so soft, it was barely a whisper. She wrote in it every night. Agnes nodded, her eyes misty with tears. "That's right, sweetheart," she said softly. "Your mother loved that journal. It helped her keep all her important memories safe." Elle looked up at Johnny, her young face filled with a serious kind of uncertainty. "And you're sure I can keep it?" she asked, a hint of worry in her voice. Agnes felt a fresh wave of tears building behind her eyes. Because what happened next? No one could have predicted. And it's something Elle will remember for the rest of her life. Stay with us, because this story isn't over yet. And then, Agnes Bennett, the pillar of strength throughout the funeral, finally broke. Her composure crumbled as silent sobs racked her body, her shoulders trembling with grief too heavy to hold inside any longer. She sank to her knees beside the fresh mound of earth, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch the cold marble of the headstone. "Oh, Sharon," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My sweet girl. A daughter should not leave before her mother. It's not right. It's not fair." Elle, watching her grandmother fall apart, felt something stir deep inside her. A surge of protectiveness, a strength that belied her young age. She stepped forward, wrapped her small arms around Agnes's trembling shoulders, and held her close. "It's okay, Grandma," she murmured, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her own eyes. "Mommy wouldn't want us to be sad. She'd want us to remember the happy times." Agnes turned, enveloping Elle in a tight embrace. "Oh, my darling," she murmured. "You're so brave, just like your mother." Elle held her grandmother close, offering whatever comfort her small body could provide. Then, after a moment, she pulled back slightly, her young face serious as she looked up at Agnes. "Grandma," she said, her voice filled with a maturity beyond her years. "Thank you for giving Mommy such a beautiful funeral. The flowers, the nice coffin, even our pretty dresses. It must have cost so much. But it made everything feel special. Just like Mommy was special." Agnes felt her heart tighten at Elle's words. The innocence in her granddaughter's assumption brought a fresh wave of pain, and something else. Guilt. She glanced up at Johnny Depp, who had been standing nearby, respectfully silent, giving them space. And suddenly, she understood. Her breath hitched. With a deep inhale, she gently took Elle's hands in hers. "Oh, sweet child," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You know we couldn't afford this funeral on our own. The tombstone, the beautiful coffin, even our dresses. These weren't things we could have managed." Elle blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "But if we didn't pay for it, who did?" Agnes slowly turned to Johnny, her expression filled with silent questions. "The hospital told us about a special benefactor," she said slowly. Someone who arranged all of this. I didn't understand at the time, but now. She trailed off. Her gaze locked onto Johnny. He remained silent, his face unreadable, but he didn't deny it. And that silence was confirmation enough. Agnes let out a slow, shaky breath. "You came all this way," she murmured, wonder and gratitude lacing her voice. "You must have arranged all of this. For Sharon." She swallowed hard. "But why? How did you even know about us?" Johnny shifted slightly, as if almost embarrassed by the attention. It's a long story," he said softly. "One that's probably better told somewhere more comfortable." Then, his voice grew even gentler. "The important thing is that Sharon received the care and respect she deserved. In her final moments, and after." Agnes nodded slowly, her mind struggling to process the weight of it all. This man, this world-famous actor, had done all of this. For them. Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. And in those two words, a universe of emotions. Elle, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Depp?" Her voice was small, but clear. Did you know my mommy?" Johnny opened his mouth to answer. But before he could, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Dark clouds, which had been gathering all morning, now threatened imminent rain. Agnes looked up, concern crossing her face. "We should get out of this weather," she said, struggling to her feet. "There's a cafe not far from here. Maybe we can talk there?" Elle clutched the journal tighter to her chest at the mention of rain, clearly protective of this final piece of her mother. Johnny noticed the gesture. He nodded. "Actually," he said gently, "if you're comfortable with it, maybe we could talk at your home instead. It might be more private. And I think Elle would feel better having her mother's things safely inside." Agnes hesitated. For a brief moment, she looked like she might refuse. But before she could answer, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. She exhaled sharply. "All right," she conceded. "Let's hurry before we're soaked through." As they rushed toward the cemetery exit, Elle kept her mother's journal and locket shielded under her coat, clutching them as if they were priceless treasures. And as the rain fell in earnest, turning the gray morning into a stormy afternoon, the emotions of the day swirled just as chaotically. Johnny guided them toward his car. And not the limousine one might expect from a Hollywood star, but a modest sedan. A simple choice. A personal one. And as they settled inside, the rain pattered against the windows, creating a cocoon of white noise around them. From the rearview mirror, Johnny watched as Elle traced the intricate designs of her mother's locket, her small fingers moving over the patterns as if trying to memorize every detail. And then, she slowly opened the journal. What she saw inside would change everything. Stay with us, because the story isn't over yet. The car ride was mostly silent, each lost in their thoughts. Elle absent-mindedly explored her mother's belongings, while Agnes stared out the rain-streaked window, still processing the day's events. Curiosity got the best of Elle as she opened the locket, only to find it empty. "It's empty," she whispered, disappointment lacing her voice. Agnes offered a sad smile. "Your mother always said she was waiting for the perfect picture to put inside. Now, you get to choose." Elle clutched the locket to her chest, nodding solemnly. As they pulled up to their small, worn-down home, embarrassment flickered across Agnes's face. "Mr. Depp, I should warn you, our home, it's not," but her words trailed off as Johnny took in the peeling paint, the broken garage door, the clear signs of struggle. "Please don't worry, Mrs. Bennet," Johnny said gently. The rain poured harder as Johnny, ever the gentleman, grabbed an umbrella and escorted them inside. The starkness of the home was striking, bare walls, empty spaces where furniture once stood. Everything had been sacrificed in the battle against Sharon's illness. Agnes, visibly uncomfortable, began apologizing. "We had to sell nearly everything to pay for Sharon's treatment." Elle, unfazed, patted the worn carpet beside her. "You can sit here, Mr. Depp. The floor is comfy." Johnny's heart clenched at her quiet resilience. "This is perfect," he said, lowering himself beside her. Agnes, ever the gracious host, insisted on making tea. She returned with 3 mismatched cups, 2 plastic, 1 chipped ceramic. "I'm afraid we don't have much to offer," she said, her voice tinged with shame. Johnny accepted the cup with a warm smile. "It's perfect, Mrs. Bennet." "Thank you." As rain drummed softly against the windows, Elle finally voiced the question that had been lingering. "Mr. Depp, did you know my mommy?" Johnny set his cup down carefully. "I didn't know her personally, but I learned about her in an unexpected way." Agnes and Elle leaned in, listening intently. It had started at the hospital. Johnny had overheard staff discussing Sharon's condition and the impossible financial burden her family faced. The story stuck with him, a mother sacrificing everything for her child. He couldn't walk away. He found a way to help, arranging for the funeral, the tombstone, the final tribute Sharon deserved. Agnes wiped away tears. "You did all of that, for us?" Elle's voice was barely a whisper. "Mommy had cancer, and we didn't have enough money to make her better." Johnny hesitated before answering, glancing at Agnes for permission. She nodded, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, your mother had a choice, to fight for herself or to save for your future. She chose you." Elle clutched the journal to her chest, her mind grappling with the weight of it all. But then Agnes's face darkened. "There's something else, something we haven't told you." Their financial struggles had led them to loan sharks. Ruthless men. When they could no longer pay, the threats began. They lost everything, even Sharon's treasured locket and wedding rings. Johnny's expression turned serious. "Mrs. Bennet, that's not just cruel. It's criminal." But then came the shocking twist. Johnny pulled out his phone, showing them a photograph, their stolen belongings, recovered by police. "They caught the men who did this," he explained. "And your mother's things, they were being kept as souvenirs." Agnes gasped. "You got them back?" Johnny nodded. "The wedding rings, the locket, the journal, all of them." Tears welled in Agnes's eyes. "You've given us back pieces of Sharon we thought were lost forever." Elle wiped her face with her sleeve. "But what about other people? People like Mommy?" And that's when everything changed. Johnny made a decision. "I want to start a charity," he declared. "One that helps families like yours, people caught between the cost of treatment and survival." Agnes gasped. "A foundation? In Sharon's honor?" Johnny nodded. "Your mother's legacy shouldn't end here. It should live on, helping others." Elle's face lit up with a spark of hope. "Like Mr. Tillman," she blurted. Agnes's breath hitched. "Oh, sweetheart. Mr. Tillman, their elderly neighbor, had cancer too. He couldn't afford treatment. Just like Sharon." Elle's eyes locked onto Johnny. "Will you help him too?" Johnny's smile was warm, but serious. "I'd love to try." And just like that, a new mission was born.